We begin Second Kings with King Ahaziah, who falls out of a window and gets badly injured, but notice the name of the god he seeks out to know whether he'll recover, Baal Zebub. That should sound familiar. However, the Greek text calls Baal a goddess, and the word means the fly god of Akron. So it's not a different god, it's just describing what that god is rather than a formal name. So at any rate, that's where you get the name Beelzebub. That's where it comes from. But notice a different usage of the phrase angel of the Lord here. The passages make clear that this is Elijah. This helps us remember the primary meaning of the Greek word angelos as messenger and not always supernatural being. So scripture refers to the supernatural ones as sons of God or the angels of heaven or the holy angels, and context always has the final say on word meaning. So that's why, even though that's the exact same phrase, in the context it's clear that it refers to Elijah as God's messenger here. And then we'll go down to verse 7. And again, I'll probably just roll the right side because they skip and don't match up sometimes with the Greek here. So in verse 7, we see that the king sends 50 men to go arrest Elijah, who calls down fire from heaven on them. And for some reason, the king repeats this futile effort 2 more times. But the 3rd time, the 50 men plead, well, at least their general pleads with Elijah not to turn them into a large order of fries, and God tells Elijah to go with them. But verse 15 uses that phrase again, the Lord's angelic messenger, which I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the original languages to see why angelic and messenger are used together, because that would be redundant, because that's what angel means. Maybe the words would be actually heavenly messenger. And this time it is, by the context, supernatural. So, and in one way or another, it's either an angel of heaven or a theophany of the pre-incarnate Christ. At any rate, at verse 15, they go back to the king, and Elijah tells him he will die because he sought help from a false god. And when he does, he is succeeded by his brother Jehoram, since he had no son. And then we come to the departure of Elijah from this world in chapter 2. And it's a very similar departure to that of Enoch long before, because he is told to travel to Jericho and tells Elisha, his protege or apprentice, to stay behind, but Elisha refuses to leave him. And several times along the way, local prophets all come up to Elisha and say, you know, God is going to take your master from you today, right? And Elisha, of course, is not happy and tells them to shut up about it. He knows it's going to happen. He doesn't need people to keep needling him about it. But they arrive at their destination, and we can see in verse 8. And as 50 other prophets stand and watch, Elijah does a Moses by rolling up his cloak and striking the river with it to part the waters. And after they cross, this is where the departure, like Enoch, is, although it doesn't mention fiery chariots and horses. In this case, in both cases, what they have in common is that they're taken alive to heaven. So we have this fiery chariot and horses pull up between Elijah and Elisha, and it takes Elijah up to heaven while Elisha watches and cries out. And in case you didn't know, this is where we get the phrase chariots of fire. Then Elisha, to see if he did indeed get the prophetic gift Elijah had, repeats the parting of the waters with Elijah's cloak. So now go down to verse 14. And the prophets that witnessed all of this pay respect to Elisha as the new main prophet of God. So then we go down to verse 19. And this next section is another favorite of the critics, because Elisha calls to God to deal with a pack of young troublemakers who are immediately attacked and killed by 2 female bears. These were not 5 or 6 little boys, but a gang of over 40 men who by scriptural convention could be as old as 20 or 30 and still be considered youths. So even if we take the median age from various commentators, they were at least well into their teens and old enough to be responsible for their actions. Even so, it is not Elisha, but God who deems the gang worthy of death. So they were a gang, and they were big enough to kill people, and so this was not what the critics painted as a few children just being snotty brats and God killing them. This is not the situation at all. So now let's go down to chapter 3, and it's back to this endless string of wars. And down to verse 11, we see that the kings of Israel and Edom call for Elisha to find out if God will help them in battle. And God grants them aid through miraculous provisions, and he uses a sort of, I guess, optical illusion to lure the enemy to its death. They see these pools of water in a distance, and they think it's pools of blood and that the armies have killed themselves, and so they're going to go in and plunder them. But that doesn't how it works out, and then seeing that he was defeated, the king of Moab, who attacked, decided to try and please his God by making a human sacrifice of his own son, who would have succeeded him on the throne. So now we know where the movie Avengers Infinity War got the idea for Thanos to sacrifice the only one he loved. This is not a new idea. But this concept should not be a surprise to Christians, since John 3:16 says the same thing. God showed his love for the world by giving up his only and beloved Son. But now, before the critics cackle that this makes the God of the Bible no better than Molech or Chemosh, ask them whether the children in those religions had a choice in the matter. Because Jesus clearly did, per passages such as Philippians 2:5-11, where it shows that Jesus volunteered. He laid down his own life. So, apples and oranges. So let's go down to chapter 4, and it's time for Elisha to do a similar miracle to when Elijah helped that one widow and her son. This time the widow is facing foreclosure and the taking of her sons as slaves to pay debts incurred after the death of her husband. So Elisha is able to provide her miraculously with enough olive oil to sell and pay the debts. And then down in verse 8, like the widow's boy who was deathly ill, the other widow, Elisha comes to another place where a woman is barren, and he asks God to give her a son in her old age. But down at verse 18, one day the boy seems to suffer some kind of cerebral hemorrhage, it seems, and he dies. So she goes to get Elisha, who goes back to her home where he prays, and God revives the boy. So we have this cycle again. It's like a spiral. The way God deals with people is seemingly repetitive, but in a progressive sort of way. So that's what a spiral is. If you picture a spring, it's a repeating cycle of circles, but they move. They go in a line, in a vector, and go some distance. So God is progressing through history through something like a spiral pattern. And it's my understanding this is the way the ancient rabbis understood prophecy and so forth as well. So let's go down to verse 38, where there's another incident of, and several incidences of Elisha's miracles, including one that foreshadows Jesus' miracles of feeding thousands of people with only a few loaves of bread, and in this case some grain instead of fishes. So let's skip down to chapter 5. And another familiar incident, the one where the Syrian general Naaman contracts a devastating skin disease, which is typically just translated leprosy. Every skin disease is called leprosy for some reason, but he had acquired a Hebrew slave girl for his wife, and she recommends that Naaman go to see Elisha for healing. So now we go down to verse 10, and when he arrives, Elisha tells him to wash 7 times in the Jordan River and he will be healed. But Naaman feels insulted by such a demeaning exercise, so he stomps off in anger, but his servants talk him into doing it anyway, and he's healed. So he offers Elisha a gift, but Elisha refuses to accept any payment. Then Naaman makes a very odd request, a jar of dirt, basically. Well, actually much more than a jar, but his reason is so that he can take the soil of Israel with him and worship Elisha's God on it. So he's very grateful and accepts his God. And notice also he asks for forgiveness in advance for his duties that he has to perform that include helping his master worship the god Rimmon. And so he's saying, look, I have to do certain things that are against the new God that I have adopted. And then he can only say that he asks God to grant him some slack in that regard. And the lesson for us is that sometimes circumstances do force us into gray areas, but God knows our heart, and we don't know other people's hearts. So we should be slow to judge and quick to forgive. However, as Christians, we take our rules from the epistles, where especially Paul teaches that we should do everything possible to avoid the appearance of evil. So if it's unavoidable, for whatever reason, then we should cut people slack, because God probably will as well, and he knows their heart. But we should never take that as a license to sin. That's a bad attitude toward God. So let's go down to verse 19. And as Naaman is leaving, Elisha's servant Gehazi runs after him and lies to him that Elisha changed his mind about the gift. But he really just wanted it for himself. So Elisha curses Gehazi, who had lied to him about it, and why anybody does that, I don't know. Lying to a prophet or psychic just doesn't make sense to me, but that's what Gehazi did. And so Elisha curses him and all his descendants with the very skin disease that Naaman was cured of. So that was a bad idea. So now let's go down to chapter 6, verse 8. Because we skipped past, there was this minor miracle of somebody was chopping wood. One of the prophets was chopping wood, and the axe head flew off into the river and sunk. And he's like, "Oh no, that was borrowed. I'm in trouble now." And Elisha throws a stick on the water, and it floats to the surface where they can retrieve it. That's not a big deal as far as Elisha is concerned, but we skip past that, and we come to the time when he defeats this army. And through a series of revelations of Syria's military plans that he had gotten, the Syrian king begins to suspect that there's a mole among his advisors. But one of them tells him that it's really Elisha who's getting intel from God, basically. Then we'll go down here to verse 13, where we see that he sends, the king sends a small army to arrest Elisha during the night. But the next morning, Elisha's servant looks up and sees that they're surrounded by this army, and he's all alarmed. But Elisha says something totally nonsensical, that they outnumber the enemy. There's 2 of them and a small army on the other side. So he prays, and God opens the servant's eyes to see that the hillside is actually covered with the same kind of fiery horses and chariots as what took Elijah alive to heaven. These are the armies of heaven. So now Elisha prays that God would strike the enemy blind, and he tells them that they've come to the wrong place. So he offers to lead them, very helpfully, to another path. But they didn't realize where they were until they found themselves in Samaria. So when the king of Israel sees them there, he asks Elisha if he should wipe them out. But Elisha just tells him to throw a banquet for those people and send them home. And the result is that the Syrians would never again attempt to raid Israel. They knew something bizarre happened. They knew where they were going before they went to Elisha's house. But then they're stricken. I don't know if it's strictly blindness or just confusion that they didn't recognize the place, and he sends them away, and they realize when they get there what just happened. So they're afraid to attack again. And that's why God didn't allow the Israelite king to wipe them out, because there was this other purpose in mind. So then we go down to verse 24. And they, instead of invading Israel, they decide to invade Samaria, and the siege they put up against it results in such hardship and starvation that the people who are in the siege decide it's all Elisha's fault. So they go after him. As we see in chapter 7, he assures them that God will bring them food the very next day. And as it turns out, there were some poor diseased people outside the wall who decide that they're going to die one way or another, so they defect to the Syrian army to get some food. But when they get there, it's deserted, because God had caused them to hear the sound, the Syrian army, to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a large army during the night, so they took off. So the lesson for us here is that if it's the way we should explain why we evangelize. People say we're fear-mongering. But the truth is, we're like these poor people who found food during a famine, and they go off to tell other people where to find food. That's what the salvation message is. That's what evangelism is. We're people who have found salvation, and we're trying to tell other people where to find it. That's all. That's our motive. It's the kind thing to do. Just as these poor people, if you read the text, decided it wasn't right for them to sit there and gorge themselves on food when everybody else was starving, so they go back and tell the king, so that we can see that in verse 9. And they tell the king the good news, but the king thinks it's a trap. Come and just plunder us. And they think, well, no, we're not that dumb. We're going to send out scouts and make sure the report is true. And again, Elisha's prophecy comes true. The very next day, they all had food. So now in chapter 8, it's back to this woman whose son had died and Elisha raised to life. And he warns her that a famine is coming and she should move to another place for 7 years. And then we're going to skip down to chapter 9, past some more accounts of kings and betrayal. This is just repeating over and over, different people, but the same events. And skipping past that, we come to the annihilation of Ahab's family and his widow Jezebel. An army assembles at Jezreel, where Naboth's vineyard had been. You remember that from the last lesson. And King Jehoram is confronted by King Jehu over his tolerance of Jezebel's idolatry. Again, that is Jezebel's sin, idolatry and murder. It is not taking the lead over her husband or any but other man. That's not her problem. Scripture never hints at that. So anyway, he tries to get away, but Jehu shoots an arrow and kills him, and his body is thrown onto the field that belonged to Naboth, just as God had prophesied. Then we'll go down here to verse 27. And we see there that when Jezebel hears of this, she gets all dressed up and then leans out of a window to shout at Jehu as a murderer, but he tells the eunuchs around her to throw her out the window. Okay, so she's got this entourage of eunuchs to be her guard, basically, and some of them decide they've had enough for her and they throw her out the window. And she hits the ground and her blood splatters all over the place. And then Jehu runs his chariot over her, so, literally throwing her under the bus. And that's what you call payback. I mean, not only is she dead and she's splattered all over the place, Jehu runs her over with his chariot. But when he finally orders later, he goes home and eats. There's no, another day in the life for them in those times, very brutal. But he goes home and eats, and then he's like, you know what, we should bury her. She was a princess after all. She had been royalty. And when they went there, though, they found nothing but her skull, her feet, and her hands, because as prophesied, she had been eaten by dogs. So again, people love to gloat over her demise just because she's a woman. But when compared to just about anyone else at that time, they all should be equally gloated over. Her sin and punishment had exactly nothing to do with her gender. So now let's go down to chapter 10. Jehu proceeds to finish wiping out Ahab's family, another prophetic fulfillment, along with the prophets and priests of Baal. But as we can see down here in 29, get there eventually, this summary here, he failed to destroy the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, and by the time of his death, Israel's territory had begun to shrink from conquest. They were being slowly losing a war of attrition. And after this are accounts of restoring God's temple, but more kings and political intrigue. And so we're going to skip past that. You can read that later. Go down to chapter 13 and verse 13. And eventually we come to where Elisha knows his days are numbered. And we're often tempted to fault God when illness or disaster comes upon us, but in spite of being a loyal prophet of God, Elisha is stricken with a terminal illness and he dies. So we can't think that this is God's punishment, or that somehow God has promised that if we're faithful that we won't have the troubles of life that everybody else has. That's not how it works. So we go down to verse 23. And we're again reminded of God's determination to keep his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Hebrews were never completely destroyed as a people. But the narrative goes on to show how God's prophecies keep coming to pass in every detail. And then let's go down to chapter 17 and down to verse 7, which we've skipped past a long succession of kings, and the narrative pauses then to summarize this pathetic account of Israel and Judah, the end result of which was that Israel was deported to Assyria and Judah was decimated by robbers. So let's go down to verse 24. Whoops, something wrong with my verse numbers here. This is where sometimes it's really hard to keep the two things straight. And I might have gotten the verses from the other section, but in those days, in general, a conquering king would populate the conquered land with his own people and deport the natives, whether they were the original natives or not is irrelevant. And this happens in our day as well, though more slowly and more stealthily. Under the pretense of compassion for refugees, foreigners are being flooded into Western lands to be supported on the backs of the working class in order to ruin and humiliate the most loyal and productive citizens. This is proof that the evil leaders funding this operation consider the West as conquered people. This is historical precedent, and we know these kind of people, these leaders, are generational evil. They go back many, many thousands of years with the same plans because it's the same source, Satan. And the habit has been, then as now, when somebody is a conquered people, you displace the people who were living there and replace them with your own. That's what's happening in our day. But back to the text here, in a vain effort to appease what the Assyrians thought was a regional god, they simply added the worship of the true God to their pantheon, as many have done today, up to the present day. They've done it all through the church age, so to speak. That's what ancient Rome had against the Christians at first. They considered anyone an atheist who didn't worship all the gods and honor all the gods. So if you left even one out, you were an atheist. And so the Christians left out all but one, and that's why they were persecuted at first. It had nothing to do with religious beliefs per se, but with failure to accept all the pantheon of Rome. So then later we will see that when Christianity, so-called, was institutionalized by the state, then the problem there was substitution again, because the temples and the statues of gods, the idols, were simply given a Christian veneer. So, you can read in any historical account, on one day the pagans would worship in these temples and worship their gods, and the next day the Christians would come, and basically they were just reversing the name tags on everything and calling it Christianity. And that's where the corruption was pretty much sealed at that point. But let's go down to, and I'm thinking, I've got chapter 18 and 19. Somehow we got back to chapter 1. I don't know how that happened. And so let me go to 2 Kings 18 and see if it'll line up. Nope, that didn't work. 2 Kings 18. There we go, finally. Now we come to King Hezekiah of Judah. And he turns out to be one of the few good kings in the list. And one of his acts was to destroy the bronze serpent that Moses had made because people had turned it into an idol and named it Nehushtan or something like that. And the lesson for us, as should be obvious, is that any good thing can become an idol, and when it does, we have to destroy it or remove it from our lives one way or another. So even this good thing that God ordered and Moses did in a foreshadowing, as we mentioned in that lesson, of Jesus being lifted up on the cross and whoever looked to him would be saved, this had to be destroyed because people turned that into an idol, and people in the church age have also turned things into idols, such as particular Bible translations. It's been turned into an idol and a dividing point. This is the teaching of division. And other pet theories or founders of various denominations can also be turned into idols, no less so than the Roman practice of taking these idols and calling them saints and so forth. So then we'll go down to verse 12. And in time, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invades Judah, and Hezekiah pays him off with gold from the doors of the temple. And then in verse 28, we can see that, we get down there to verse 28, that Sennacherib tries to turn the people of Judah against Hezekiah. And then in chapter 19, Hezekiah seeks out the prophet Isaiah. So this is his lifespan now. The prophet Isaiah, major prophet, he seeks him out to speak to God on his behalf, and God assures him that Syria will not prevail. And then God makes this very long pronouncement against them. You can see here in poetic form. And then down about verse 25, though, let's go back up here a little bit. Actually, verse 28. where God says he'll put a hook in Sennacherib's nose and lead him back the way he came. This exactly matches, almost exactly, the wording of another prophecy in Ezekiel 38:4 concerning the future war of Gog and Magog, where the hooks are put into the jaws and the army is Gog and Magog are led the other way to some place they don't want to go. So this is a very, very close parallel to that. And then in verse 34, notice that God states once again that the only reason a remnant of Judah will be preserved is because he keeps his promises, in this case, the one to David. So God's messenger, take that however you want, kills 185,000. This is actually, has to be supernatural by description here. Kills 185,000 Assyrian troops in their own camp while they sleep. They're just wiped out in one fell swoop. You wonder why God doesn't do this all the time, but again, we have to trust him to have his purposes. And then in chapter 20, now it's Hezekiah's turn to have a terminal illness, and Isaiah comes to tell him he won't recover. But when Hezekiah pleads with God to remember how he had served him faithfully, God grants him 15 more years to live. But notice the sign he asked for to confirm the promise. The shadow of the sun, which moved along a set of stairs to mark the hours, would go backwards 10 steps. Surely the entire world would have a record of this event, just as with the long day of Joshua, because it would have severe effects on the earth if the earth's alleged rotation had reversed, which would have to be the case if the only reason the sun appears to move is because the earth is spinning. So, as with Joshua's long day, the simplest explanation is that it isn't the earth that moves. The Bible never describes the earth as moving. Take that however you want. Now to verse 12. When the king of Babylon heard that Hezekiah had been ill, he sent gifts and a letter. So Hezekiah naively shows his representatives who brought the message and the gifts all the riches in his whole kingdom just to be hospitable at best. And of course, he was boasting. This is a huge tactical error. So God sends Isaiah to tell him that in time all the things he showed the Babylonians would be carried off to their land along with some of his own descendants. But notice Hezekiah's reaction. All he cares about is that it won't happen in his lifetime. That's very, very selfish, but there it is. And then chapter 21, as soon as he dies, his own son quickly undoes all the good his father had accomplished. Lather, rinse, repeat. And then down in verse 9, this is the last straw, and now God has to completely remove the remnant of Judah from the land. So then we go down to chapter 22, for a few more short-lived kings later, and we come to Josiah, who faithfully follows God. And in the process of restoration, Hilkiah the high priest finds the scroll of the law that had been pretty much forgotten, and he has a scribe named Shaphan read it to the king. Then we'll go down to verse 10. And as soon as he hears the words, Josiah is very distraught, and he orders his officials to find someone to interpret the laws properly. So they send for another of that half of the human race deemed by sinful men to be incompetent as witnesses, a woman named Huldah. She is a prophet, and her husband supervises the king's wardrobe. That's right, she's the spiritual leader, and he's running the royal laundromat. This is not to demean him, but to give her the respect she deserves and has been robbed of by generations of Christian theologians. Now let's go down to verse 13. And she answers them by saying, "This is what the Lord says. Thus saith the Lord, with all the authority of any male prophet. She should not and must not be demeaned because of her flesh." She tells them that God has decreed disaster for them all and that nothing can be done to prevent it. But because Josiah is a decent person who honors God, none of this will happen until after his death. So down to chapter 23. In the meantime, he assembles the whole nation to make them hear the words of the law, and then he orders the destruction of all the implements of Baal worship, including worship of the heavenly luminaries. And again, we see that such worship is forbidden by God to answer the critics' claim that the Bible promotes it. This is not sun worship. This is the opposite of it. It is forbidden in the Bible at every turn. Now we'll go down to verse 15. And finally, the shrines at Bethel and Dan are destroyed. They've been left alone by a lot of even, the few good kings, but now they're destroyed. Then we'll go down to verse 20. and or actually 22, and we find out that the Passover had not been observed since the days of the judges in either Israel or Judah, and they wonder why they're under judgment. So let's go down to verse 26. Then Josiah is killed in battle, and his son Jehoahaz goes right back to the evil practices of the past. Likewise for the next king, and that's when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacks and subdues the entire region. So I'm going to go down to chapter 24 and verse 8. And he also carts off all the riches from the temple of God and the royal palace, just as predicted, and then uproots the people of Jerusalem and transplants them in Babylon. That's how it was done. That's how it's being done to us today. And then he appoints a succession of vassal kings, basically, to govern the area. And then down in 25, verse 8, we see that he's going to destroy Jerusalem. He finally has the captain of his guard burn down the temple, the palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. And the walls of the city are broken down as well. And we'll see this in I think it's Nehemiah, the undoing of this. But even so, a few poor families are left there, likely to keep the land from becoming a wilderness or being overrun by wild animals. So they're left there to keep it from totally becoming unusable. And so the people to whom God had offered so much were completely removed from the promised land because they couldn't help themselves from cheating on him. Even God's patience runs out eventually, but he never breaks his unilateral promises, even if 90% of his people have to be abandoned. That's what we're supposed to learn from all this. We sit here from our vantage point in time and think we wouldn't be like them, but the truth is that we forget what God has done for us, and we live like he doesn't matter, except as something like an elderly relative in a nursing home that we come to visit once a week. That's how most people treat God that claim to be Christians. And like the Hebrews, we only run to God when we're desperate, and then we wonder why he doesn't seem to hear our prayers. These are the lessons we should be learning from these events, that we aren't any better, that we can't sit here and point our fingers from moral high ground and go, we wouldn't be like that, we don't do those terrible things, but actually we do. So that is the end of the books of Kings, and Chronicles is a little bit of a different turn, goes back to the genealogy thing, as you can see a little bit there, but that's it for 2 Kings.